In this long lecture, I would like to address the topic of political parties and elections. So I would like to unify these two topics into one, because the purpose of political parties is to choose candidates for elections and then to try to get those candidates elected. That is why I do not separate these two topics. So let's talk about some of the basic terms first. Party platform is the official statement that describes the party's position on key policy issues. Office holders are not required to follow the party platform, and it is impossible to force them to follow it on every point. However, there are official and unofficial pressures on elected office holders to follow these elements, to follow various elements of party platform, and the party leadership is actively pushing them to do so. For example, if you're a member of Congress and you want to get or maintain your favorite committee assignment, you may want to, at least some of the time, toe the line that the party leadership wants you to toe. The main goal of political parties, as I said, is to choose candidates and to get them elected. Because this is a pragmatic or instrumental goal, there's sometimes compromise. You see, in order to attract quality candidates, and sometimes to avoid them from switching parties. Switching parties is rare in American politics, but it has occurred certainly in the past. So, because parties pursue this pragmatic goal of electing candidates, political parties have existed for a long time and will continue to exist. They are simply necessary. They're like a hammer or a nail or a chainsaw or any instrument that you need in order to build things. So it's not something that you can get rid of simply because you do not like the divisiveness that political parties accentuate in a society. The truth of the matter is that they structure, they organize elections. That is why every democracy has political parties and not just the United States. There are at least three distinct elements of what we mean by a political party when we talk about this term. First are the office holders who organize themselves and pursue political objectives under a party label. What I mean by organize themselves, for example, in Congress, Democrats are organized and Republicans are organized. Party and organization are the workers and activists who make up the party's formal organization structure. These people can sometimes become precinct captains. They can go and on behalf of the party volunteer to knock on people's doors, to get them out to vote for a particular party candidate. And finally, there's party in the electorate. These are all the people who affiliate with a political party, either psychologically or formally through registration. Political parties in America were born in the late 18th century. The first two parties were the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. George Washington did not officially belong to any political party, and in fact he warned against the spirit of partisanship when he was leaving office. John Adams was the first president to officially belong to a party, and of course he was a Federalist. Democratic-Republican domination in the era of good feeling. After the election of 1800, Democratic Republicans became ever stronger as a party, and the Federalist Party began to fade. So much so that between 1817 and 1825, there was no national competition to speak of. There was really one party controlling everything: presidency, Congress, and the Federalist Party disappeared. And that was so-called era of good feeling, because you only had one political party. The election of 1800 was the truly competitive party election, and Congress had to settle this election because no one had the majority of Electoral College votes. Jefferson and Burr were both Democratic Republicans, and they each got 73 Electoral College votes, and then John Adams came in third with 65. So Congress had to pick between Jefferson, Burr, and Adams, and it just so happened that Jefferson became president and Burr became vice president. In 1804, Jefferson easily won re-election against Federalist Pinckney, and in 1808, Jefferson's Secretary of State, James Madison, the writer of the Constitution, was elected president, replacing Thomas Jefferson. So that was the election of 1808. Madison was re-elected, of course, in 1812. In 1816, we had another Democratic Republican easily defeating Federalist king, and that Democratic Republican was James Monroe. In 1820, Monroe once again won presidency. You can see that by then, the Federalist Party, for all practical purposes, ceased to exist. John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, got only one electoral college vote. In 1824, we had a division within Democratic Republicans. There were 4 different candidates: Adams, Jackson, Crawford, and Clay. And John Quincy Adams became president, even though he won fewer electoral college votes and fewer popular votes than Andrew Jackson. But you can see by the breakdown that no candidate had the majority of electoral college votes. And just as in 1800, that meant that Congress, the House of Representatives, had to settle this election. And because of the machinations of Speaker of the House Henry Clay, John Quincy Adams became president. This is sometimes known as the corrupt bargain that denied Andrew Jackson presidency, even though he was winner of the plurality of electoral college votes and winner of the plurality of the popular vote. The election of 1828 was Jackson's revenge. Jackson finally became president, easily defeating John Quincy Adams. And 1832, now there was no longer a Democratic-Republican Party, but rather Democratic Party. The part after the hyphen, the Republican part after the hyphen, had been dropped simply because Jackson didn't kind of moved into another direction. He alienated a lot of people, so the party began to split, and some followed Jackson, and Jackson's followers became known as Democrats, and those who opposed him eventually became known as Whigs. And so you can see Jackson easily won re-election in 1832. In 1836, Martin Van Buren, another Democrat, won election, and you can see I mentioned Whigs. Van Buren's candidates, Van Buren's opponents rather, were all Whigs. Harrison, White, Webster, and Mangum, they were all Whigs. Then we have William Henry Harrison, a general, winning an election in 1840, defeating Martin Van Buren. So Harrison was a Whig, but his presidency did not last very long. He spoke at his inauguration for too long during a stormy and cold weather. He contracted a cold that became pneumonia, and he died several weeks later. So William Henry Harrison had an extremely short and extremely uneventful presidency, noted only by his terrible illness that killed him. And when he died, John Tyler, his vice president, became president. But in 1844, we had a Democrat, once again Democrat, not a Whig, James K. Polk, defeating the Whig Henry Clay. And Polk became a one-term president. He was probably the most consequential one-term president in American politics because he roughly doubled the size of the United States. This is because on his watch, Texas was annexed in 1845. Texas had been an independent country between 1836 and 1845. The United States annexed it, and this provoked a war with Mexico, which the United States won and increased its territory by, almost doubled it, almost about 100% increase in the territory. The next election I want to talk about is 1856. Democrat James Buchanan won this election. It was notable because this is the first election in which we get our two major parties as we know them today, i.e. Democrats and Republicans. What do we see here? We see that John Fremont, the first Republican candidate for president ever, was making actually a good run, but he still lost to James Buchanan. Fremont was a former general and kind of a direct politician. I would not say a particularly skilled politician, but nevertheless, the rise of the Republican Party, whose main platform was opposition to the spread of slavery into the western states and territories, was the forerunner of things to come, of divisive things to come, and especially the Civil War. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln won presidency in a four-way race. The reason why is because the Democratic National Convention of 1860 failed, and they could not agree on one candidate. The Southern delegation came out, left the convention, and they appointed their own delegate, Southern Democrat John C. Breckinridge, who was James Buchanan, former vice president. So Breckinridge represented the Deep South, the part of the country that was most deeply committed to the idea not just of slavery, but of the need to spread it, because they were afraid that if slavery does not spread into Western territories, then Southern states would be geographically, socially, and culturally isolated, and they would die. Their system would collapse. And the opposite of him was Abraham Lincoln, whose position was protect slavery where it already exists, but no slavery in Western states or territories at all. And then you had John Bell and Stephen Douglas, each representing a slightly different side of the country, but very close ideologically, because both of them wanted to talk about the need to compromise and to preserve the Union, and not about slavery versus non-slavery. Stephen Douglas, the little giant of the Senate, was able to win only New Jersey and Missouri, and John Bell represented the border states like Kentucky, and what else did he win? I think he won Virginia, which is, of course, southern state, and John Bell was also able to win Tennessee. And in both of these states, slavery was legal, and by the way, also in the state that Douglas won, Missouri, slavery was legal. But these states contained strong pro-union sentiment, and that's why they got some electoral college votes out of there. Lincoln won 60% of the electoral college vote because, precisely as I explained, his opposition was split three ways, and 40% of the popular vote, 60% electoral college vote. That was enough. No sooner did he win than South Carolina seceded. He won in November of 1860, and of course he had to wait until March 4th of 1861 to actually become president, and South Carolinians decided not to wait. They just left the Union, and then in February of 1861, six more southern states seceded and created their own Confederate States of America, and it was on. The country was falling apart, and then later four other states would leave the Union: Virginia, Tennessee, Arkansas, and North Carolina, and that would bring the total number of southern states to 11. We had a civil war which lasted 4 years, took the lives of at least 625,000 Americans, but at the end, of course, the Union won and the South lost. 1864 was a wartime election. Lincoln was challenged by George B. McClellan, 37-year-old former commander of the Army, and McClellan lost. It's interesting that Lincoln feared that he might not win re-election, and his fears turned out to be unfounded. 1868, we had another Republican, Ulysses Grant, a talented general, but not a talented politician, or let me put it this way, not a talented president. His administration was virtually submerged in corruption. And as a result of this, the Republican Party suffered significant diminution of reputation. And even though Grant would win re-election in 1872, by 1876, the reputation of the Republican Party has fallen so much that Republicans really had to struggle to win. Rutherford Hayes, quote-unquote, won the election, but that was only because the bipartisan committee that was appointed to resolve disputed states gave all 4 disputed states to Hayes, including Florida, a state which, properly speaking, he probably lost. He lost the popular vote in Florida, and he should have lost the election, but the commission gave him Florida and gave him presidency anyway. This is because a bargain was made, and the bargain was that a Republican would remain in the White House. In other words, Grant was leaving, and another Republican, Hayes, would come in, right? So a Republican would continue to control the White House, but in exchange, the Union troops that still were occupying portions of the South would be withdrawn. And so this is why Tilden, who, properly speaking, should have won this election, was denied presidency, and Hayes became president. And we have the so-called golden age of political party, which begins soon after the election of 1876. It was characterized by several things like party stability, party organization controlling state and local government, a pervasive impact of parties in the lives of millions of ordinary Americans. Now, what does this mean? Party stability means that people were not switching parties very often. Parties were kind of clearly attached to different geographical regions. Also, party organization controlled state and local governments. This is not true anymore because many positions, particularly at the local level in today's world, are non-partisan. Not all of them, just many of them. And also because if you controlled local politics during that era, you could also very easily give out government jobs in exchange for political support. Now, I understand that to some extent this is still happening, there's still corruption, but not nearly as pervasively as it was happening during the golden age of political party, when party bosses, usually mayors of big cities, were able to run the so-called party machine that awarded government jobs and sometimes other perks and benefits to their supporters. And there was a pervasive impact of parties in the lives of millions of ordinary Americans. I will demonstrate this in a second. So that was the golden age, and it lasted from roughly 1876 to about 1912, when the so-called Reconstruction, that is to say after the so-called Reconstruction era, and until the rise of the Progressive era. Now, exactly what were the party machines doing for citizens? Between the 1840s and 1880s, there was a lot of immigration into the United States from countries like Ireland, Germany, Greece, Italy, and Russia. And a lot of immigrants came in, didn't speak English or didn't speak English well enough. They needed jobs, so party bosses would provide jobs. Sometimes food and clothes, bail bonds. If your uncle got into a drunken brawl, who would bail him out of jail? Don't worry, the boss would bail him out of jail. And then just remember to vote for the boss. If you need to vote, vote twice. The saying was, vote early and often. So there was a lot of corruption, and so much so it was really out of control. Entertainment. Remember, this was before, we are now between 1876 and 1912. This was before radio, television, internet, talking movies. So you needed to entertain yourself somehow. So parties would organize torchlight parades, weekend picnics, and community events. In other words, in these big cities, particularly in these major ethnic neighborhoods, party machines acted very much like the mafia. They helped you out, but then in return you should be loyal and return the friendship. You should help them out, which meant vote. And if you have to vote more than once and break the law, who's going to catch you? You see, so dead people voted sometimes, and people voted multiple times, etc. During the so-called Golden Age, 75 to 80% voter turnout rate was a typical voter turnout rate. In today's world, it's about 50 to 60%. And remember, people were far less educated back then. This is to the point that education is an answer to everything. How do you get people more involved in politics? You try to educate them as to its importance. Well, here we see people not being very educated, but understanding through personal experience why it's important to vote, because you get shoes and clothes and a job and bail bonds in return. During the election of 1880, we had Garfield elected. He would be assassinated in 1881 by a disappointed office seeker. In 1884, Grover Cleveland, interesting guy. He was the first Democratic president since the Civil War to be elected. Remember, we had Andrew Johnson, also a Democrat. He called himself National Union, but really he was pro-Union Southern Democrat who served president after Lincoln was assassinated. But Andrew Johnson, remember, was never elected. He was a president by accident. But Cleveland was the first Democrat ever to be elected since after the Civil War. Then we had a very interesting event. Benjamin Harrison became president of the United States. in 1888, he was elected, and he was a grandson of William Henry Harrison, the general who died after giving that very long inaugural address. So Harrison defeated Cleveland. Cleveland had a weak campaign. He did not keep his eyes on the prize. He sort of let this election slip away. But it's interesting that he came back stronger, Cleveland did, in 1992, and defeated Benjamin Harrison. This was amazing. A feat never before observed and never again repeated in American politics. Grover Cleveland became president, elected to 2 non-consecutive terms. So that was 1892. 1896, William McKinley. This is when we get our kind of first settled pattern of parties. William McKinley inaugurates the clear age of the Republican Party. What the Republicans stood for back then is, to a significant extent, what the Republican Party stands for today. That is to say, big business interests. Big business and foreign policy that is aggressive and outward oriented. That was the interest of bankers, railroads, businesses of all kinds. That was the modern Republican Party beginning under William McKinley. The opposition, Democrats led by William Jennings Bryan, stood for the so-called common man, for the interests of the average person, for more rural interests. We had a rematch in 1900 between exactly the same two candidates, McKinley and Bryan, and once again McKinley won and Bryan lost. So same pattern. And then next year in September, in Buffalo, New York, William McKinley would be assassinated by a terrorist, Leon Czolgosz. So he was replaced, of course, because he died. He was replaced by his vice president, Theodore Roosevelt, and then Theodore Roosevelt won election in his own right in 1904. In 1908, William Howard Taft, another Republican, became president. And once again, who challenged him? Well, of course, William Jennings Bryan. This was Bryan's third time, and for him, third time wasn't a charm. He once again lost. Poor guy. He was like always the bridesmaid, never the bride. He just couldn't win. Then you have, in 1912, a very important election because it illustrates a very significant point with regard to third parties in the United States. It pitted 3 candidates against one another. Woodrow Wilson, the Democratic challenger, William Howard Taft, the incumbent Republican president, and Theodore Roosevelt, the returning once Republican president who had been out of presidential politics, now returning as a third-party so-called bull moose candidate because he said, I'm as strong as a bull moose. The problem was that Roosevelt disliked Taft's passive presidency. And Taft never liked being president. He always wanted to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Presidency just wasn't for him. And it's interesting that after losing this election, Taft would eventually go on to become Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He's the only American ever to serve both as president and as a member of the Supreme Court. Anyhow, because of this split between Taft and Roosevelt, Wilson, the Democratic candidate, was able to win an overwhelming victory. You see, because the other two guys split the vote between the same constituents, between the same Republican supporters. Wilson became the first Southern Democrat to win presidency since the Civil War. Remember, Cleveland was the first Democrat, but Cleveland was from the North, and Wilson was from the South, particularly from Atlanta, Georgia. And even though he faced strong opposition, the opposition was split 2 ways. He won an easy victory, and also Wilson was the first and so far the only professional academic, the only PhD, the only person who taught for a living, to become, who taught professionally, university level, full-time, and then became university president at Princeton University. So the only academic ever to serve as president of the United States, Woodrow Wilson. 1916, Woodrow Wilson would win re-election, but he could not win a third term because he had a stroke in 1919, and so third term was out of the question for him. 1920, 1924, 1928, we had a series of weak Republican presidents, but they suited the times because the times were the roaring 20s, and people were buying for the first time cars, air conditioners, refrigerators, radios, and the life of the average American seemed to be getting better and better. Cities were growing, wealth was growing. It was really a new era, a new dawn in American history, and as it turned out, in human history. And when that happens, Republican candidates for president tend to have easier time because they emphasize, remember, since McKinley, the allegiance to business. Big business is very good. And as long as big business was making those cars and refrigerators and radios, everything was cool. So Harding was a non-entity, and he died in 1924. He was replaced by Calvin Coolidge, also known as Silent Cal, who was known for being silent and for having once said, "The chief business of the American people is business." And then you had Herbert Hoover, elected in 1928, but after the stock market crash of October 1929 and the subsequent depression that began in 1930, 1931, Americans wanted a change. Hoover was too slow to implement it, too indecisive, didn't go far enough. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, won a landslide victory in 1932, and then Roosevelt was re-elected in 1936, winning all but 2 states, crushing Alf Landon in the 523-8 Electoral College vote tally. And then in 1940, as the Second World War was already raging in Europe and in China, Roosevelt was re-elected. Not as decisively as before, but still very, very strong showing because people did not want to change horses in midstream. We also have to understand that by November of 1940, the Great Depression was for practical purposes over. If you look at the unemployment rate in 1933, it was 25%. If you look at the unemployment rate at the end of 1940, early 1941, it was 10-11%. So the economy was still a little rough, but the Depression was over. 1944, the Second World War was still going on. The outcome, however, was not in doubt. It was clear that Germany and Japan were about to be defeated. Roosevelt won a strong victory over Thomas Dewey, and then he died in April of 1945. Roosevelt did. Truman succeeded Roosevelt as president in April of 1945, but then in November of 1948, Truman was elected on his own merit. Once again beating Thomas Dewey, Strom Thurmond was a Southern candidate who was pro-segregationist. And Southerners, see, they could not bring themselves to vote Republican because Republicans were the party of the Union, the party of the Civil War, the party of Northern aggression. However, here you see some Southerners resenting the Democratic Party, but especially President Truman for racially desegregating the military. Prior to 1948, there were separate white units and separate black units, but President Truman, by executive order, desegregated the military, and this turned off a lot of Southerners. Hence, Governor of South Carolina, Strom Thurmond, launched this third-party bid. But his candidacy was not enough to harm Truman. 1952, 1956, Eisenhower won. Well, here we go again. What is the similarity here between the 1950s and the 1920s? The similarity is the age of prosperity. The 1950s, just like the 20s, was once again a new era, a new dawn. You had drive-ins, rock and roll, you had youth culture, you had credit cards appearing for the first time. There were no general credit cards before the 1950s. Interstate highways were being built. Because of this, people wanted a unifying figure. People wanted someone who would be not too engaged in politics, not divisive, somebody who would be a nice consolidational figure, like a friendly older uncle who would bring the country together. So 52, 56, easy victories for Eisenhower. 1960, not an easy victory. What happened, in fact, was that in 1951, the 22nd Amendment was ratified, and it said that no one can serve president more than twice, more than 2 terms. So because Eisenhower had to leave presidency, someone else had to be elected. And Eisenhower's vice president, Richard Nixon, was at first considered a heavy favorite. However, he was challenged by this relative newcomer, handsome, relatively young Senator John F. Kennedy. And Kennedy was able to win because of some of the good choices that he made, like putting Lyndon Johnson on the ticket as vice president. Because of this, Kennedy was able to win Texas, and also because there was some voter fraud in the state of Illinois, where the remnants of the old party machine, led by the mayor of Chicago, Richard J. Daley, some say was able to find graveyard votes. In other words, dead people voted for Kennedy in Illinois in order to carry that state. So barely Kennedy was able to squeeze out a victory. He was assassinated, of course, as you probably know, by a former Marine, Lee Harvey Oswald, in November of 1963. So what did that mean? That meant that in 1964, Lyndon Johnson, who was now serving president because Kennedy had been assassinated, Lyndon Johnson ran for presidency and won easily against Barry Goldwater, a candidate who was painted successfully by the Johnson campaign as being too extreme. Goldwater was able to win only his home state of Arizona and several southern states, specifically 5. This should be a warning sign for Democrats, and in fact, this should be a signal for you. 1964 is a year when the electoral realignment begins in earnest. That is to say, Southerners no longer associate themselves with the Democratic Party as much as they once did, and slowly they're willing to move toward Republicans. They haven't yet made that wholesale move. Not all of them, but you can definitely see the movement away from Democrats, because Democrats became the party of the civil rights. If Truman integrated the military, then Johnson, because of his push for the Civil Rights Act, integrated society as a whole, because the '64 Civil Rights Act made racial segregation of privately owned facilities illegal under the federal law. So Southerners begin to move toward Republicans in 1968. See, Johnson, the Democrat, refused to run for president because of the problems. Like, the war in Vietnam was not going well, and there were riots at home, and he felt like he was failing, and his health was kind of getting worse, and he was exhausted. He decided not to run for president. So Democrats put up Herbert Hoover, who turned out to be a very weak candidate. And what do you know? Richard Nixon was resurrected like Phoenix out of the ashes. Richard Nixon, former vice president for President Eisenhower, came back and strongly beat Herbert Hoover. And note that in this election there was a strong third-party candidate, Governor George Wallace of Alabama. Lynyrd Skynyrd, the band from Florida, had a song, Sweet Home Alabama, in which Wallace was prominently mentioned. And where the lyrics go, "In Birmingham they love the governor, hoo, hoo, hoo." That was George Wallace. Four-time governor of Alabama. He would be elected 4 times during 4 different decades to governorship. And his whole thing was segregation. Segregation before, segregation now, segregation forever. He was known to stand in a school door of a segregated school and trying to prevent black children from entering that school. And it's interesting that he won 5 states in the Deep South in 1968. But his candidacy was not enough to harm either Nixon or Wallace. And it was clear that Wallace's voters were much closer to Nixon than to Humphrey. So Nixon easily beat Humphrey in this election. In 1972, Democrats really had a doozy because they put up George McGovern, and Nixon did something incredible. He beat McGovern 49-1. No one had ever done this before, not even Roosevelt. Roosevelt won by 41-8 against London, and Nixon here 49-1. So, no, I think Roosevelt was 47-2 because Hawaii was not yet a state. That's why there were 49 states. So Roosevelt won 47-2, dropping just 2 states. But Nixon dropped only 1 state, so it was incredible. However, 2 years later, Nixon had to resign because of pending impeachment proceedings against him. So to avoid being impeached and then convicted in the Senate, to avoid it, Nixon resigned. In 1976, because of the disillusionment with the Republican Party of Nixon, Carter, a Democrat, was able to win. Carter himself was from the Deep South. He was governor of Georgia. And for this reason, many southern states were able to and willing to vote for him, even though most of them have actually moved on already psychologically. And in terms of party affiliation, was probably running close to even between Republicans and Democrats, but certainly they were willing to vote for him because he himself was a Southerner. So Carter won that election, defeating Gerald Ford, but in 1980, Ronald Reagan, who was born in Illinois, but who made California his home state, where he once served as governor, Ronald Reagan easily defeated Jimmy Carter. In 1984, Reagan repeated Nixon's record, winning 49 states. Walter Mondale barely won his home state of Minnesota and Washington, D.C. Reagan won everything else. George Bush Sr., the 41st President of the United States, easily defeated then Michael Dukakis in 1988. Dukakis' campaign was ran by Susan Estrich, who was inexperienced, didn't have any national campaign experience before then. And Dukakis made several mistakes. This turned out to be an easy election for George Herbert Walker Bush. But then things change. We enter a modern period. If you're a student and you're listening to these lectures, many of you were born soon after 1992. What happened here is actually quite interesting. The Democrat Bill Clinton came out of nowhere. He was a governor of a small state, Arkansas, and he was much younger than George Herbert Walker Bush. He had virtually no foreign policy experience, and George Herbert Walker Bush was a very experienced foreign policy president who had just won the Cold War, who had just won Operation Desert Storm. America was riding high in the world. America was the most powerful country in the world. It was respected, and partly this was due to George Herbert Walker Bush. But the economy tanked in 1990-91, and Bush was slow to address it. So Clinton capitalized. Clinton said, "I feel your pain," and he connected with the voters. So he was able to win. He took California. For the first time in a long time, Democrats won California. California was going Republican over and over again, but Clinton took it away. And since then, California keeps voting Democratic. And we are close to the end. 96, Clinton won easy re-election over Bob Dole. The age of the internet was on and the economy was improving, so Clinton easily won re-election. 2000, Bush, very closely contested election, defeated Albert Gore. Now, I think it's important to point out there was a third-party candidate here, and his name was Ralph Nader. Nader took 9,000 votes approximately in Florida. Most of those would have gone to Gore had Nader not been on the ballot. So the formula here for this election is Gore plus Nader equals Bush. Nader really ruined it for Gore. This was very much like the election of 1912, when in fact Teddy Roosevelt ruined it for William Howard Taft. So the lesson about third parties is third parties act as spoilers. They ruin it for the party that is closest to them ideologically because they siphon off votes from that party. Election of 2004, George W. Bush easily won re-election. Well, not easily, but convincingly won re-election against John Kerry. Senator Kerry lost, but still note a pattern between 92, 96, 2000, 2004. The entire West Coast keeps going to the Democrats. They have a control over the left coast, and yet Republicans win elections because they're so strong in the South and in the middle of the country. 2008, Barack Obama has a crushing victory over John McCain. Once again, he completely controls the West Coast, but now his power extends also to Nevada, the state that Bush carried both times. Obama was also able to win New Mexico and Colorado. Significant demographic changes had taken place in those states. Between 1988 and 2008, the states became a lot more Latino than they used to be. Obama easily won those two states in 2008, and Obama won Florida in the South. He won Florida. He was also able to win North Carolina and Virginia. Both of those were surprises because before Obama, Republican and Democrats had not been able to win North Carolina since 64 and Virginia since 1960. Obama won Indiana by less than 1 percentage point, but he still won. It was really a very decisive victory. 2012, Obama still won a clear victory. The only two states that he gave up versus 2008 were Indiana and North Carolina. But he won everything else that he won in 2008, he actually held in 2012. We see the pattern clearly, do we not? The left coast is Democratic. The Northeast is solidly Democratic. And the northern portion of the Midwest is solidly Democratic. Other states are still up for grabs. But in all recent elections, Republicans begin with a disadvantage because they're not competitive in presidential elections in California, New York, and Illinois at all. Those three states with a lot of electoral college votes automatically, there's 55 in California, 29 in New York, 20 in Illinois. Those aren't competitive at all. They go immediately to Democrats. So Republicans have to win pretty much everything else. And it's a struggle. And that's why whoever wants to be a Republican candidate has to be able to figure out how to broaden his or her appeal and won a greater share of minority vote, because Republicans during the first 2 decades of the 21st century have not done a good job trying to get minority votes. George W. Bush was okay. He won just over 40% of Latino vote in 2004. But they need more. And because of continuing demographic changes, unless they can win more, they're going to continue to struggle and lose presidential elections. Thanks.